have so many friends and allies in the room. My name is Karina Lipsman. I'm the Director of Government Affairs here at the Victims of Communism. And we are looking forward to a great reception here, along with our special guests. And so without further ado, I will hand it over to our President and CEO, Dr. Eric Patterson, for our opening remarks.
Well, good evening and welcome. As many of you know, in 1993, the U.S. Congress authorized the establishment of what became the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. It was signed into law by President Bill Clinton later that year with a purpose of remembering, looking back towards the 100 million people murdered by communism in the past, as well as a forward-looking mission to be an advocate for the liberty of those still held captive by communist regimes and totalitarian regimes to this very day. And of course, this China Forum in its 11th year fits right into the heart of that mission. And so tonight and then tomorrow, you will hear from some of the best minds helping us to understand the context, but then also helping us to be thinking about what can be done. Of course, an event like this could not happen without the generosity of a number of sponsors, and I'd like to draw your particular attention to our hero and freedom sponsors, the Sarah Scaife Foundation, the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy, and Catherine Wendell's. So would you help me in thanking them, please? I'm delighted also that tonight we have some members of our Board of Trustees with us. Later from this evening, you'll hear from Ambassador Paula Dobriansky. We also have Ambassador Aldona Vash and the Honorable Bruce Weinrod. Thanks for joining us tonight, as well as members of our academic and advisory councils, including Dr. Carol Edelman. Carol, thanks for being with us tonight as well. Well, with that, let's get right to the heart of the matter. We couldn't do this work, this China Studies work, without the leadership of a great public intellectual, researcher, and advocate. And of course, you all know him, Dr. Adrian Zintz. Adrian, please come.
Well, thank you so much, dear guests and everyone. Thank you so much for coming. And welcome to day one of the China Forum. This year we're holding the 11th VOC China Forum. Initially, this was a one-day event when we started out with a focus on policy and academic analysis on this very overarching or important topic. Several years ago, we decided to add a half-day event tonight to focus more specifically on the victims of the crimes perpetrated by the Chinese Communist Party. And this year, the focus of day one is a very important and emerging topic, the topic of transnational repression. We often think of authoritarian control as something that happens inside a country's border. But what happens when dissent moves abroad? In recent years, authoritarian and, of course, particularly communist states have skillfully adapted to our globalized world. They've developed a new toolkit to reach beyond their borders, to monitor, influence, and silence their critics, whether they are political exiles, activists, or simply members of a diaspora community. This strategy is now increasingly known as transnational repression, or TNR. This does not merely involve a few isolated cases. Fueled by new technology and increased brazenness, TNR has become a systematic, even normalized part of how autocratic regimes are operating. Understanding this phenomenon is critical to our understanding of modern authoritarianism. It shows us how these states manage dissent in a world where a person's voice can no longer be contained by a physical border. While high-profile incidents like assassinations garner the most attention, the repressive repertoire used by states such as China is far broader, often employing subtler yet profoundly damaging approaches. The spectrum of tactics includes digital and physical harassment, coercion by proxy, which refers to attacks on a family of diaspora members in order to silence them, infiltration, disinformation campaigns, and so on and so forth. The response from democratic host nations has, on the whole, been inadequate. There are too many instances where victims reported credible threats to Western governments, only to find their reports met with a lack of tangible protective action. And there's even people, Uyghurs, Tibetans, and others, Hong Kongers, sitting in this room who have experienced that. This inaction is partially explained by the strategic nature of the threat. Autocratic regimes have evolved their tactics and supplemented overt coercion with less visible, yet equally sophisticated mechanisms of control. These, what I refer to as low transgression tactics, often fall below the threshold of criminal prosecution in Western host countries, leaving law enforcement and security services without clear mechanisms to intervene. However, there is progress. Based on my own recent discussions with government officials in Ottawa, London, and Berlin, which I was able to hold this year, just in the last 6 months, I can confirm that transnational repression is in fact rapidly becoming an emerging priority on Western national security agendas. In June 2025, the G7 statement facilitated by Canada provided a formal acknowledgement of the threat. This statement explicitly condemns TNR as, quote, an aggressive form of foreign influence that undermines national security, state sovereignty, the safety and human rights of victims, and principles of international law. This recognition reframes TNR not merely as a diaspora protection issue. This afternoon and evening are dedicated to this important topic. We can look forward to 4 segments. First, we will hear from Grace Jin Drexel, daughter of Pastor Ezra Jin, who was recently arrested by Beijing for his Christian faith. And thank you for being able to come. Second, we will have a fireside chat. Why is there no fire? No, just kidding. The fire is still being made. We will have a fireside chat where VOC trustee Ambassador Paula Dobriansky speaks with Mike Gallagher about the TNR threat in the United States and the efforts of Congress to combat it. And thank you so much, Mike, for coming and doing this. Third, we will have a panel on TNR with scholars and representatives from key affected diaspora groups. Fourth, last but not least, we will have a book talk featuring the book title Unbroken by Rusha Nabas about her indomitable fight to counter the CCP's ongoing genocide against the Uyghur people, despite herself encountering sustained transnational repression. So a practical example of the very phenomenon we are talking about. Thank you so much again for coming.
Thank you, Dr. Patterson, and thank you, Dr. Zenz, for the opening remarks. And now I would like to invite Grace Jin Drexel.
Thank you so much, everyone. This is probably one of my first time speaking, so I'm a little bit nervous. But on October 10th, my father, Pastor Ezra Jin, was taken by the Chinese authorities along with nearly 30 pastors and church leaders from Zion Church. 22 church leaders now remain in prison with him because of the prominence of the church and the brazenness of China's repression. Their case has become an international incident and has been profiled by the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, BBC, Associated Press, and beyond. Many were taken in front of their young families who they now leave behind. My father and several other older leaders struggle with various health issues, and we are deeply concerned about their treatment in prison. I'm here today to plead for my father and the 22 others because there is a window of opportunity in the next 20 days or so before they are indicted and formally arrested. I urge the Chinese government to release all these Zion Church members immediately and unconditionally. The Chinese Communist Party seeks to control everything and everyone in China, including the most intimate part of us, which is our belief. However, as many here can attest, as powerful as the Chinese Communist Party and many other authoritarian governments are, they will never be able to take that from us. Even in the case of Zion's Church's own history, we've already seen how government attempts to coerce and control the faithful have backfired, laying bare the hollowness of the authoritarian ideology, the strength of faith, and ultimately growing the church. In 2018, the government seized our assets and sanctuary, but could not overcome the spirit of faith and love that animates the community. That pressure pushed us to develop a hybrid online-offline model that went nationwide, growing the church to the largest it's ever been, often reaching 10,000 individuals daily. And yet I admit feeling despair and helplessness when my father and others who are merely trying to live out their faith in God's word and to serve families and communities around them are persecuted, dragged away from their homes in handcuffs. My father is now in prison because of his love for China and for its people. He had multiple opportunities to settle abroad and each time decided to go back to China. He knew the risk and chose to minister and serve in a land that was hostile. And I believe that is the type of faith that the CCP fears the most. My father's example and my Christian faith propels me to believe that God has not abandoned China and that God loves China and has a plan for the nation and people. Therefore, despite not knowing why this is happening and in this depth of despair, I draw strength in knowing that God is a good God and that even in the bleakest moment, He might be using it for bigger things. And we need not despair completely, for our work is not in vain. As a Christian, I also believe in miracles, and we are praying for the full release of all 23 imprisoned church leaders today. I believe that one day we might stand together, and to quote Václav Havel, the long-persecuted Soviet dissident and later president of Czechoslovakia, during his meeting with Pope John Paul II, that this moment I am participating in a miracle. I'm so grateful for everyone here today, grateful for Victims of Communism Memorial, and all those who have worked hard to make this event happen. Thank you for all the leaders here today and for standing with us in our fight. Thank you for the press and for your time in shedding light to these cases. And most of all, thank you to the countless brave individuals who we will hear more from, who stand up to the oppression of China and serving as an example to us all. Thank you.
Grace, thank you so much for sharing that. Obviously very recent and heartbreaking to hear, but this is the reality of our world today, and we are all going to pray that your father, as well as the others that were taken, are safely back to their families. And with that, I would like to invite our guests for our fireside chat, Ambassador Dobriansky and Mike Gallagher.
Good afternoon, everyone. And let me first turn this mic on, and let me first just thank Eric and Adrian for organizing the China Forum, and also Grace. We're very deeply touched that you're with us today. Thank you for your presence here, and I think you have everyone here who's very much behind you and certainly seeks a release of your father and a resolution of this case. It's just outrageous. It really gives me a great deal of pleasure in introducing our honorable fireside chat interlocutor here, the Honorable Mike Gallagher. Mike is the head of defense at Palantir Technologies. He also is a fellow at the Hudson Institute. There are a number of people affiliated with the Hudson Institute here in the room. He also certainly is well known during his tenure in serving in Congress from the 8th District of Wisconsin from 2017 to 2024. He was a very outspoken, aggressive, and engaged and impactful chairman of the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party. He was also chairman of the House Armed Services, the I guess it's the forum that was on cyber information technologies and innovation, if I have that right, and also a member of the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence from 2019 to 2021. So we're really very pleased that you could be here. As you heard, the theme is really focused on transnational repression. But I want to begin with looking at what you have really been focused on and how this fits in it and how you can comment on it. During your tenure as chairman of the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, you said and you've written about that the need is to win, but not just to manage the Chinese competition with China and the Chinese Communist Party. So the question for you is, what are the most effective strategies here? Say a word about the geopolitical environment that we're in. What are the tools at our disposal? And how can we deal with this very egregious violation that's not only in China, but it's outside of China. It's global. So welcome again to you, and look forward to hearing your views.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. I've long admired your career, and it's been fun to collaborate through the years. And I have to say, your Halloween swag is A+. Halloween is big in my house right now, so I'll just take a picture. I'll send it to my daughter. Thank you to the Victims of Communism Foundation. This is an incredible national asset we have right here. And so if this is your first time here, or if you're a longtime friend, please spread the word. We want as many people as possible to come and see the incredible resources on display here. And I think an underappreciated part of what the OC does that really wasn't apparent to me until I chaired the committee was sponsoring world-class scholarship. Dr. Zenz is a great example of that. And the work produced by this organization was absolutely essential to our work on the China Committee. So thank you to GOC for everything you do on this important topic. For this whole discussion, the caveat is Kissinger has this line in his memoirs to the effect of the intellectual capital that political leaders bring to office gets consumed. They don't create more of it while in office. So 8 years in office drained all of the brain power that I had, which was meager to begin with. And I look at this august, distinguished audience, and I don't know what I could possibly say that's of interest to you. I said it all during my 2 years training committee, but I'll try not to be totally boring or rehash old arguments. If you look at sort of the article that I published with Matt Pottinger in Foreign Affairs, No Substitute for Victory, 80% Pottinger's ideas, 20% mine, but that was a powerful 20%. The less boring 20%. But Matt's a true expert. We tried to articulate what a sort of goal or end state for U.S. trans strategy vis-a-vis China would be. Because one thing that struck me in Congress was, while we spent a lot of time talking about the ways and means of U.S. strategy, and there was broad agreement between Democrats and Republicans, there was really no agreement, let alone or even discussion, about what we were trying to achieve over the long term. And if you looked at the old Cold War with the Soviet Union, the opposite was true. We spent a lot of time in the late 40s and early 50s debating aggressively what we were trying to do with the Soviets. And then we haggled for decades over different variants of containment. And in the present day, I think we need to have that debate. I think we can imagine an end state in which the Chinese Communist Party is not only deterred from external aggression, but there is an internal opportunity for the Chinese people to chart a better course. Now, that doesn't mean I'm advocating for a policy of regime change per se, but it does mean that I long for the day when the CCP collapses under the weight of its own internal contradictions, and we can have a freer, brighter, better China. Because the primary victims of the CCP's aggression are indeed the Chinese people. We have to remind ourselves of that fact. How do we get there? I remain convinced, and maybe this is military bias speaking, that the most important variable is the conventional balance of hard power. I think, particularly dealing with the Marxist-Leninist regime, they tend to sort of respect hard power, and other instruments of U.S. national power draw strength from our hard power and strong military deterrent. But that does not mean that we subordinate issues like human rights, or a lot of issues that the DOC is focused on, to pure security considerations. In fact, I think we lose nothing by prioritizing those issues, particularly with the current regime in China. And I think it actually adds to our overall deterrence strategy to shine a light on what the regime is doing internally in perpetrating genocide, what's it's doing externally in terms of transnational oppression. The only thing I'd add, because I've gone on for too long, is that I do think with all these things, whether you're talking about military deterrence, or whether you're talking about your ability to talk about human rights and have people take you seriously on the world stage, what is unique about the current situation is that we find ourselves economically and in some areas technologically dependent on China, which is an unacceptable state of affairs. People won't speak up if China has the ability to shut off access to rare earths, if China has the ability to control the economic livelihood of people around the world. So we have to do the difficult, expensive, and tedious work of weaning ourselves off our dependency on communist China in critical areas if we are to have a hope of preventing a war and then helping the Chinese people have a brighter future.
So clearly by pursuing that kind of strategy, we'd be laying down very clear markers as to what we stand for, what we will do, what we won't do. Let me ask you a question that always gets in the mix, and that is, in dealing with, let's say, transnational aggression, how do you factor in, or do you, diplomacy? Does diplomacy fit into this issue in conveying what we want and stating it very clearly to the Chinese Communist Party?
Absolutely. I think there's a strand of thinking in my own party and in the Democratic Party as well, which suggests, well, because the situation, let's say, with respect to Taiwan is so perilous, and we find conventional military deterrence eroding, that we shouldn't speak up. We shouldn't use the diplomatic instruments of national power to shine a light on what's happening with Grace's father, to talk about the way in which the invasion of Taiwan has already begun in the information space, to talk about what has happened in Hong Kong, thus eviscerating the idea of one country, two systems, to talk about what's happening in Tibet, to talk about what's happening with my own church, the Catholic Church, inside China, that this would be provocative. I would encounter this all the time on the committee. It's like, if you say this, it'll be provocative. Or if you take, in the economic domain, if you take steps to defend yourself with robust export controls or with guardrails around outbound capital flows, that somehow this would be provocative. I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy that we face. It's a fundamental understanding of what I call the Padre paradox. Though I'm sure Matt stole it from Diamond or Bob or some other expert in the audience, which is to say that when you're dealing with a Marxist-Leninist regime, the more you try to accommodate them, the more you pull your punches, the more aggressive they become. Eisenhower has his first speech really as a presidential candidate in 52, speaking to the VFW, he sort of talks about the totalitarian mind and makes a very basic point, which may seem obvious to all you experts, but it's worth reminding ourselves in the present day. It's like regimes like this sort of need, in order to survive, they need to expand aggressively externally, and they constantly, through salami slicing and other tactics, are expanding their repressive nature beyond their own boundaries. If we forget that fact, and if we're constantly pulling punches for fear of provocation, we're actually enabling more aggression. So absolutely, I think you can use diplomacy both to speak up for what we stand for, what we will not accept, but also to maintain dialogue in other areas. I was never, I criticized what I called former President Biden's zombie détente with China. I'm not saying never negotiate or talk to the CCP. I mean, that would be illogical. But do so from a position of strength, and do so with a clear-eyed understanding of who's sitting across from you on the other side of the table. And at least remind yourself that in modern history, the CCP has violated every agreement that it's signed up to. And so therefore, you should be very skeptical about things that are hashed out, in Brussels or wherever we do.
I think the point is well taken about the balance of influence here.
Could I make up, it's so nice to have people listen to me again. Wow, I feel like I'm back, drunk. dangerous. Don't give me a microphone. I wonder, push back, because you have more experience in this area. I think we in America sort of think in this binary, like, diplomacy or war, black, white. The eagle's either facing the olive branches of peace or, the arrows of war. Like, that's not how the world works. And that's certainly not how China operates, right? I think they're far more comfortable in the gray zone. Everything is gray, right? Everything is sort of some state of war. And we need to get more comfortable pushing back in the gray zone and not look at it as a binary choice between, okay, well, now we're doing diplomacy, so let's put the brakes on everything that's more competitive, if that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. Personally, I agree, and that's why I use the word balance.
Yeah.
I think you have to balance, the tools and instruments that one uses to get results.
There's a great George Kennan Wisconsinite quote where he says, you have no idea how much it contributes to the general politeness and pleasantness of diplomacy to have a nice little quiet armed force in the background.
I was going to say, I think Reagan actually took that approach.
Yeah, exactly.
We know that the Chinese have really leveraged economic instruments, and they've used it to the core, especially in terms of leveraging and pressuring others to support their policies. And tragically, going back to the theme here, that's another area where some have become very complicit because of this economic leverage. So what do we do to get around that, actually?
Well, first, I think we have a long way to go in terms of raising general awareness of what transnational repression is and the different forms it takes. And I'll admit, when I was first introduced to this term, I thought it was sort of the latest DC jargon, right? Transnational repression. Anything with an acronym, I'm very skeptical of, okay? I once tried to outlaw the use of acronyms on a subcommittee that I chaired. That was a military subcommittee. But asking general officers to speak without acronyms is like, it's a very difficult thing to do. But if you look at what we did on the committee, and really where my awareness was raised, and the light bulb went off for me, one of the very first events we did, and a lot of people in this room were there, was to do a rally outside the illegal police station in downtown Manhattan, which when I first read the reports suggesting this was happening, I thought this can't be true. Like extrajudicial repression on American soil in the heart of Manhattan, where we have like 1 billion police officers, American police officers, like this can't be possible. But when we did that event, I was struck by how many people came out and the reaction that it had. And I sensed in that moment that people were desperate even for our committee, which had just been formed and nobody really knew what it was supposed to do, just to shine a light on this issue and talk about transnational repression. We went from there to a college campus nearby. We talked to students that were either Chinese students or they were Hong Kongers or even Taiwanese students that were targeted on campus, that were in some cases physically assaulted on campus. Imagine being a college student and targeted, being in America, in college in America, one of the promises of which is you're allowed to think freely and say all sorts of stupid things out loud. Thank God social media didn't exist when I was in college. I wouldn't have been elected. Imagine being targeted or physically assaulted on American soil. That's unacceptable. And so I think we have a long way to go just in terms of revealing what is happening on our own soil and throughout the free world. And to some extent, that was the main effort of this Select Committee on China. Yes, we were able to pass some legislation. Yes, we did traditional committee things like hearings and reports. But more than anything else, we've tried to use the committee as a way to communicate with the American people about what was happening on American soil. And from that activity emerges all sorts of policy ideas and legislative ideas and things we can do to prevent it. But I would say that's job 1, 2, and 3. And again, why it's so important to have forums like this to spread the word on what's happening right now.
I want to build upon what you just said, but I want to pause for a moment because I am going to be turning to the audience. Now, I've been told that there were cards. There are cards. So if they haven't been passed around, we should pass them around. So definitely, so that people, if you want to write a question, write your question. That's how they are organizing it, and then we'll pass it forward so I can get your questions in this case.
Does that prevent hecklers from yelling?
But definitely, please, let's
vote me out of office.
if anyone does want, please motion to her, and maybe it's on that side as well. Okay, great. Let me build upon what you just said, because, you know, I noticed and have here, Freedom House did document that China conducts the most sophisticated and comprehensive campaign of transnational repression globally. There are some 200, at least as reported, I will put odds down there more, but 214 cases of direct physical attacks since 2014. And it's actually in over 100 countries.
Yeah.
Over 53 countries, over 100 overseas police stations, including in the United States. And then there was a recent meeting earlier this year. The Thais were pushing back and actually sending, dissidents and those back into China. The question here is, how can we be dealing with this internationally?
Yeah.
Are there countries and partners who you have dealt with? Thinking about the activism of your committee, I mean, you really had a strong platform. It wasn't only domestic. Many heard abroad. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, if I'm remembering the original, I think it was the Safeguard Defenders who wrote the initial report. Is that right, Dr. Zenz? Did you check me on that? Yeah, that's right. There was a great number of countries identified in that report, and European countries in particular, the UK, Ireland,
Well, it could be 100.
etc. Yeah, but I was struck at the time as to how this was already a global phenomenon.
Right.
And I remember we had a lot of inter-parliamentary discussions with our colleagues within the Five Eyes Alliance, and then expanding internationally about this, just to get their ideas on how they dealt with it. And there we had some examples, right? To some extent, Australia was a canary in the coal mine for CCP influence and transnational repression. A lot of what we tried to do in the first Trump administration with PLA-affiliated researcher bans, for example, was the outgrowth of the work of a young Australian academic named Alex Josky. And then a lot of the sort of efforts that we took up on the committee were a result of studying how Australian politicians grappled with campaign finance corruption and strengthening their own insidious provisions and things like that. So as with everything, I do think, with no offense to other countries in the world, for America, things tend to start within the beating heart of the free world, which is kind of AUKUS and the Five Eyes Alliance. And there I came to really appreciate the personal relationships one has to build with other legislators in other countries to get anything done. Some of my closest friendships in 8 years in office were with my counterparts in the UK, for example, Tom Tugendhat, who's been an incredibly strong voice on all these issues, Andrew Hastie, who's the Shadow Defense Minister in Australia. We kind of formed this international band of brothers, and it was just a great way to come up with ideas, pool resources. And I do think those try to say this, it has the added benefit of being true, as we think beyond the individual level as to how we as a country beat China or win this new Cold War. Yes, our network of partners and allies is an asymmetric advantage that China simply doesn't have. Now, we can't just sort of pat ourselves on the back at various conferences and say, yay, free world, yay, democracy. Like, it has to be something real, right? One thing we encountered with Five Eyes and with AUKUS is our barriers to technological collaboration are still too strong, they're still too high, right? A lot of the recent reforms on ITAR, International Trafficking and Arms Regulation, are intended to allow us to share technology more fulsomely and more quickly with the Brits and the Aussies. Even something as simple as passing security clearance or sharing information, things that are over-classified as secret note form can do enormous damage to our national security. So, and then when it gets to actual policy, again, I'm sorry to go on, I've always thought we had an unrealized opportunity when it came to cross-border data flows, for example. So I did the TikTok law. TikTok was always a small microcosm of this bigger issue. How do you manage cross-border data flows, right? And this is a very difficult thing for us to wrap our head around. The organizations we have in the U.S. government for dealing with it, something called ICTS, in Commerce in particular, are new, they don't have a lot of resources. We're still kind of trying to come up with a framework for how you regulate cross-border data flows. Well, I think back in, gosh, at least 7 years ago, then Prime Minister Abe, check my math on this, gave a beautiful speech in which he talked about a vision of data free flow with trust, where basically you would align within sort of the free world first, but then expand to countries who are willing to adopt our high standards and respect for both security and privacy, adopt sort of an international model for how the free world can regulate cross-border data flows. And that's one example of how you can sort of build alliances and coalitions in the economic and diplomatic domain that really give us an advantage vis-a-vis China. And just to hammer home another obvious point that everyone in this room probably already knows, that as we think about that advantage, I mean, we should remind ourselves that I don't think China, or the CCP in particular, is interested in having allies in the sense that America would think about it. They're interested in having states that they can control. They're interested in having vassal states. In the Middle East, they're interested in having reliable sources of hydrocarbons that they can control. We want allies and partners that can defend themselves. We will respect their sovereignty, but we all want to abide and play by and enforce the rules of the road internationally. And I'd rather be on that team than the other team.
We have a number of questions I'm going to go to. I was going to ask you about technologies, because the Chinese use cyber technologies, digitalization, and attacks on many dissidents and those who have their own views. And this is a connected question from the audience. How do you, or should private companies deal with this issue?
Well, I've always thought that the Reagan times we're choosing speech, meant it in a domestic political sense. For all the criticism I got from the business community saying, decoupling is a fantasy, you don't know what you're talking about, you haven't been to China, I go to China every day, and Leo Hug tells me all the great things about what China's doing. Like, China is decoupling from us and the West. Like, what is made in China 2025 but a massive decoupling and dominance strategy? Or it's following a dump and dominance strategy where it dumps goods on the international market and seeks to dominate those industries and further increase their coercive economic leverage. So you can either confront this unpleasant reality right now, or you can confront it when China's kicking you out of the country and you don't have business anymore. So I do think increasingly those in the private sector are going to have to choose whether to maintain a presence in China or do business in China, notwithstanding any temporary rapprochement in our economic relationship. Put differently, we now have over 3 decades of accumulated evidence to suggest that further increasing our economic and cultural ties with the CCP is not going to produce beneficial geopolitical or domestic political outcomes inside of China. So it makes sense, it's prudent for us, at least in areas that we think are critical for our national security, to reduce our economic and technological exposure to China. Another thing that always drove me wild when we confront this question of what the appropriate business relationship with China is, we did all these war games on the committee, and we invited people from the private sector into the war games, and major asset managers, Fortune 50 CEOs, like hugely rich people that, thought I was a naive, hawkish rube. And they would always say, listen, I get it. Xi Jinping's talking a lot about taking Taiwan, but he's not going to do it. I mean, his economy, they're not doing well. They got latent housing crisis issues, this, that, or the other. I thought, okay, I think you have the causality backwards. Xi Jinping's economy is in dire straits, in part because he's preparing his country for a war with the West. Like, this could indicate that a war is more imminent, not the opposite, as he tries to sanction-proof his economy. And he gives speeches talking about eating bitterness and preparing for pain. And by the way, I think their willingness in a system like that, a techno-totalitarian dictatorship, to endure pain, or at least foist pain onto their own people, is far higher than ours in a democracy. Their willingness to sacrifice lives, this is one of the unbroken lessons from the last time who fought the communists on the battlefields in Korea. Their willingness to throw away lives for the pursuit of a ruthless geopolitical purpose is far higher than ours is in America. So we have to factor all these things in to our, not only our deterrence strategy, but our economic strategy as well. I just angered all of corporate America. But maybe I'll just leaven it a little bit by saying I fully concede it is not easy after over 2 decades of trying to integrate China in the global economy and encouraging our business community to go there so that we can all have cheap stuff, to suddenly rebalance supply chains or get out of your manufacturing position in China. And I do think there's a lot of naive thinking in this town in particular around, well, it's easy, we'll just, pick everything up and we'll shift our manufacturing presence to India. Okay, that doesn't happen overnight, right? There's hard sometimes to do business in India. I would love to see a closer economic and security relationship with India, but that's going to be the work of decades, not days or weeks.
You got a lot of questions here from the audience.
That's why I've been filibustering, so I don't want to stop.
I'm trying to synthesize a few, but one did relate to the very thing that I just asked you about technology here. China is using surveillance data sets from its own, data sets, it looks like, from its own people to build large generative AI models that are aligned with communist ideology like DeepSeek. And so here the question is basically, was this an issue that during the time you were chair of your own committee that you focused on, or now about AI and how technology has been used against its own people?
I would say we didn't really, if you read our economic report, there was a lot of recommendations in there related to AI and critical technology that enables AI, semiconductors in particular. But it wasn't something, a DeepSeek hadn't yet happened when I chaired the committee, and it wasn't something we paid sufficient attention to as I look back on it. As I now look at it from the perspective of sort of someone who works at a defense technology company and does a lot in the AI space, I think we really have to appreciate the lead we had in the AI race, which could have been mattered in measures of months, maybe half a year, a couple of years ago, is now like a knife fight that's measured in days. I would further argue that in such a race, where the goal is to win, you can't think of it just like a marathon, where everybody runs their own race and the fastest person wins. It's a full contact sport where you have to play both offense and defense. So yes, we should offensively be taking measures to make it easy for the best and the brightest globally to come work in America on advanced technology, AI, quantum, synthetic biotech, etc. That is one area where we still have a narrow advantage, but China's catching up. The amount of state resources they're plowing into these areas. Obviously, civil military fusion makes it easier in some cases for them to dedicate state resources. The way in which they've corrupted Western scientists and corrupted Western universities in many cases. The way in which they've unrepentingly steal our intellectual property in various advanced technology spaces. However, defensively, I do think we need to take steps to slow them down. I don't think it would be wise to allow the CCP to leverage our most advanced semiconductors. I just don't see, if you look at what's happening in space, it's the equivalent of giving them access to like a city's worth of like super geniuses. We don't want that to happen. So we need to take steps to make our export controls more effective. There's an argument against export controls that suggests they don't work. We've tried to do them, they don't work. If you look at sort of our export control regime, it's riddled with loopholes, exemptions, licensing exemptions, such that we've never actually really run the experiment about what a coherent, simple, but strong export control regime vis-a-vis China would look like. So that's a long-winded way of me saying they're catching up. This should have been a Sputnik moment a long time ago, but for whatever reason we haven't sort of had that national call to action. By the way, I'm actually very encouraged by some of the steps this administration has taken. One of the AI czars at the White House, Sri Ramakrishnan, incredible genius, and the work he is doing, like, this is a guy who left a very lucrative private sector career to work for the government, and I think he's striking this balance between offense and defense pretty perfectly right now. We're lucky to have him in that role.
This question, I think you really already hit upon it. If you want
I'm sorry.
water
It's
there.
a nervous sick. I just keep drinking water. I was up late last night watching the Packers destroy the Steelers, so you know, get dehydrated.
I think in a way you've answered this, but because I see it here, I think it's worth your giving your response. The question is, how do you see the U.S. breaking the Chinese Communist Party confidence so that we can actually deter them?
Yeah, well, one thing I took away from the very first hearing we did, and it kind of gets to sort of the paradox in dealing with a regime like this, is on the one hand, you know, a country this large and economically powerful, and a regime where power is concentrated, you know, in 9 people or increasingly 1 person, seem to be really intimidating. And, you know, when you're looking at the biggest conventional and strategic buildup of military powers since World War II, if not greater than that, this can be very intimidating. But on the other hand, you know, there are moments, I think the white paper protests were one of them, where you're reminded that these regimes are almost inherently brittle. And if you look at the old Cold War, for how long did we sort of, you know, think or tell ourselves a story that, like, you know, there would never be like a final resolution to this competition, and you know, the Soviets, we just have to learn to live with them forever, and just, you know, things can turn pretty quickly. It's like, you know, the old Mark Twain line of how you go broke, like gradually and then very suddenly. Geopolitics tends to work like that. So I think we should have confidence that we actually have a winning hand if we're willing to actually play it aggressively. And we have all sorts of allies inside of China and in the region that we can draw upon to enhance a successful strategy. And ultimately, I think we have the greatest possible weapon at our disposal, and that's the truth. Grace referenced Pope John Paul II. I wrote an op-ed criticizing the Catholic Church and the former Pope for its unwillingness to speak truth to power in the way that Pope John Paul II was willing to do so with the Soviet Union. And, you know, his famous words, or rather Jesus' famous words, I think echo to us today, which are be not afraid.
There's a question here on an issue that you really have stood up for very aggressively, and that's about Chinese students in the United States. And the question is to talk about what the exchange of these students, and here it doesn't mention Confucius Institutes, but I am going to stick that in because you were very outspoken on that issue. But what are the ramifications of this to the United States and to our universities and to our own students?
Well, the Confucius Institute's issue is very instructive because on the one hand, we were very successful in raising awareness of the issue, forcing policy action, and now you rarely hear about Confucius Institutes per se on American campuses. But in many cases, they've just changed the name, and the problem persists. And the problem at least has 2 dimensions. One is the harassment and overt intimidation that I mentioned before. The other is the, and I would throw sort of espionage into that bucket. Side note, I think one of the most difficult things for us on the committee to wrap our heads around and to communicate to the American people was a thorough understanding of the nature of United Front work. There's no clear sort of perfect analog in America for what the United Front Work Department does, and I think a related issue is there's no cultural touchstone for Americans in the present day to understand the extent of CCP espionage. In the way that in the old Cold War, everybody knew what the KGB was. Like, nobody knows what the MSS is, obviously this room accepted, let alone the UFWD. And so I just want to plant a flag here. Maybe we can come back to that. The second aspect of it is, of course, intellectual property theft, which costs us over $315-ish billion a year, the greatest transfer of wealth in human history. So the Confucius Institute story is instructive in that we did a good thing, a well-intentioned thing, but it didn't actually solve the problem. Then we had the PLA-affiliated researcher ban that I alluded to before in Trump 1.0. Good thing, didn't solve the problem. In part because the universities weren't equipped to determine who was actually PLA affiliated. But oh, by the way, our own law enforcement and intelligence organizations were not equipped to go to universities and tell them, this person's PLA affiliated, that person's okay, this person's United Front Work Department. We sort of had a big gap in expertise and resources at this problem. So I came to believe that we actually need a much cruder or blunter instrument, which is a more expansive prohibition on CCP-affiliated students at our universities. And for those who say, you can't possibly do this, you know, how could you advocate for Chinese students not having access to American universities? Well, it violates what should always be a basic principle in our interaction with China, the principle of reciprocity. If you look at the numbers, our students aren't given the same level of access. And two, I go back to the basic point of, okay, we fostered all these cultural exchanges and educational exchanges, and I'm sure that there are individual cases where this has benefited the students or even benefited our country in some small effect. But on balance, the relationship between the two countries has deteriorated, and China and the CCP has gotten more powerful, and we've gotten less powerful as a result of this fundamental bargain. And oh, by the way, the universities are making a ton of money off this arrangement, and I challenge you to find university departments that are speaking out aggressively against the genocide in the Xinjiang province or transnational oppression. I'm sure it exists. I'm sure you all know, maybe you're affiliated with the universities, but everywhere I go, I see like a China center, and I click on like the area devoted to Taiwan, and the language seems deliberately lifted from like the United Front Work Department handbook. It's crazy, it's soft, it's flaccid, it's not true, it isn't advancing the cause of truth. I thought Harvard's motto was Veritas, truth. I'm not just crapping on Harvard because I went to Princeton, okay? But, sorry.
Speaking of Taiwan, there are several questions about Taiwan. And by the way, when these cards were handed out, I was going to suggest that people write who it's from. In this case, this is one that did identify. It's from the Taiwan Central News Agency.
Oh, right.
So specifically, they asked, what's the GOP stance as you see it on Taiwan at this time? But let me stick in one more, which is an excellent question on the topic that we're discussing today. What role can Taiwan play here?
Yeah.
You know, with us on China and the transnational repression.
Well, maybe I'll go in reverse order. Obviously, I think nobody has better experience or understanding with TNR or efforts to meddle in one's free society than one of the world's most vibrant democracies in Taiwan. And I think a critical role for Taiwan to play, from the president to the minister for digital affairs to everybody, individual citizens, is just merely to talk more loudly about what China is doing to effectuate reunification or an invasion of Taiwan via instruments other than war itself. And of course, I have no doubt that Xi Jinping would prefer the fruits of war without having to go to war. If he were to be able, via political warfare and ideological warfare, to capture Taiwan, that would be his preferred strategy. And I fear that's a strategy he's pursuing very aggressively. So Taiwan has an enormous role to play in telling its own story in recent history to the world, but it's incumbent upon us in America to listen and echo what's happening there and not turn a blind eye. Which leads, I think, to the first question, the second question. I think the GOP stance remains unchanged, which is, I mean, the official policy of America could be summarized as we're committed to helping Taiwan defend itself. I think it is a matter of bipartisan agreement that we should aim to help Taiwan porcupine itself, improve its defenses. I am not personally concerned about, some grand bargain gets cut and Taiwan, is part of that grand bargain. I don't see any appetite for that here domestically in America. But I do think American politicians or anybody that's in a leadership position has to, and to some extent this is what we try to do in the committee, constantly find ways to communicate to the American people why Taiwan matters for America, why it's in our own interest to help defend Taiwan, and why, as I would frequently say, the Las Vegas rules don't apply. What happens in Taiwan won't just stay in Taiwan. Taiwan is just the first step in the CCP's efforts to completely dominating the region and eventually dominating the world.
I have just two last questions, and I apologize. There were quite a few questions here, and so I apologize for not being able to take all of them. You give very comprehensive and robust answers, so that's
a nice way of saying long-winded.
No.
Vapid. Yeah.
So my first one here relates to the allies. The question is, what would you recommend the administration resuscitate in our relationship with our allies and in dealing with, these issues, these core issues with China? And here it goes beyond. It's rare earth supply chains, AI. Just how do you see it?
Well, I was very heartened to see President Trump's meeting with Prime Minister Albanese. I thought that was a positive step. Reaffirming our commitment to AUKUS. And there, I think, if we did nothing else in the defense industrial base in America, then realize, I'm a Marine Corps officer by trade, but a naval officer technically. I'm a navalist. You look at the map of the Pacific, there's a lot of water. We need a bigger navy, etc. I want to do the whole spiel for you. The North Star that should guide our efforts, our defense planning, should be this so-called 2+1+ sustainment goal. That's our ability to build 2 Virginia-class subs a year, 1 Columbia-class sub a year, and then sustain our AUKUS commitments. That is a very difficult thing to do. Congress has paid for more than 2 Virginias a year. It's getting 1.2, maybe less than 1.2. Our ability to build ships on time and on budget is broken. That is how we maintain our long-term deterrence right there. And there, we need the President, we need the Secretary of Defense, we need leaders in both countries to be waking up every single day, making industry nervous about their ability to deliver. So I'm just saying, there's more we can do even within AUKUS to leverage allies. Then there's the pillar 2 of AUKUS, which is all about how we collaborate in advanced technological areas. And I alluded to the barriers that exist. We've broken down some of those barriers. Congressman McCall, some others did the Lord's work in terms of ITAR reform, but there's more we can do to build out something resembling truly an international technological industrial base between us and our closest allies. And then I think if you look at the Middle East, it's reminding us of something which is incredibly important. In order to have extended deterrence, right, and traditionally this is America extends its own capabilities, particularly nuclear capabilities, to enhance deterrence in a particular region, I think you need to add an element to that. Where we have lethal allies, allies that have game, that can defend themselves and scare the you-know-what out of the bad guys in the region, we should double, triple down on that relationship. Israel's a good example of that. We have allies in the Indo-Pacific that are rearming. I'm very optimistic about the new leadership in Japan. That's the pathway to success. It's, as we push back on China's predatory practices, we need to break down barriers to collaboration with our closest allies. George Shultz had this great phrase. He talks about alliance maintenance like gardening. It's not glamorous. We gotta wake up every day. You gotta bend over and do a lot of weeding. You gotta flower. You gotta water a flower here. You gotta pick. That's what it is. It's not glamorous. It's good as you're in.
There used to be a film, Being There, and Chauncey Gardner was interviewed, and he talked about how he was watering the plants and they were growing, and so maybe that's where Schultz got that from. Last question. Actually, I'm combining my own with 2 others from the audience. I tried to put a number together here because there's quite an overwhelming number of cards. President Trump is reported, going to be meeting with Xi on Thursday in Korea. And so my question, and I'm going to tell you, mine is A, and then we've got B and C.
Yeah.
A is, what would you, if you're sitting there with President Trump, what would you tell President Trump that is important for him to say to Xi? The second question is, what should be off the table in that meeting? And the last one is, what would you hope to see from the negotiations?
Yeah, well, maybe you could ask Xi to lift the sanctions against me. That would be nice. I've heard it happen to make the big show, like, we seized all of his assets. I'm like, I don't have any assets in China. So I don't really have any assets at all. So what have we seized? I think avoid the pattern of our negotiations or high-level interaction with China are usually that we offer concessions up front in return for promises that are in the mail and never get delivered. So more than anything else, I would urge the president to study the failures of his predecessors and avoid that basic dynamic. And again, I think the theme, the high ground on which he can fight is this issue of reciprocity, right? In our economic relationship, right? Always insisting upon reciprocity. It always was maddening to me in the TikTok debate. It's like, I can't ban TikTok, or how are you going to do that? Like, well, American social media companies aren't allowed in China. How about insisting on that before we allow a CCP-controlled news outlet to infect and poison the minds of all Americans under the age of 25? So standing firm on the ground of reciprocity. And then I think, there is a way in which Trump, I think, could be uniquely effective. Because he's very good at freewheeling. He's very comfortable freewheeling in front of the press. I think Xi Jinping is the opposite of that. Like, to go back to the brittleness of the regime itself, there's also brittleness to Xi Jinping as a personality. I mean, this is like a humorless man and a humorless regime who is afraid of, like, Winnie the Pooh propaganda. So there is like a way in which Trump's style almost gives him an advantage in these interactions. So what would be off the table? Obviously, Taiwan. I think any concessions when it comes to access to advanced semiconductors should be off the table. And maybe this is a combination of what to say and also what not to take off the table. And maybe a good way to end is, why not elevate human rights? Why not talk about just the atrocious things the regime is doing within its borders and outside its borders? I think our president loses nothing by taking a page from Ronald Reagan's playbook. And in a way, also then connecting directly with the Chinese people, who are not our enemy. I mean, Reagan did this brilliantly in Moscow, at his Moscow State speech. He did it brilliantly at Fudan University in China. He was just sort of this master at sort of subtly creating a wedge between the regime and the people, and drawing upon Russian history and literature to advance the cause. And I think Trump could do something similar.
Well, the Honorable Mike Gallagher, first, thank you very much for coming today to the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. All of us really appreciate your being here, and you're kicking off the 2-day China Forum. And as always, you did not disappoint. In fact, not only did you not disappoint, but you took a very serious topic, and somehow or other, you even add in a lot of humor, if I can say that. That's a feat. Please join me in thanking you. Please stay seated, I believe, or you're announcing that, because they're going to put a panel. Okay, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mike, and thank you so much, Ambassador Brunowski. This was absolutely fantastic discussion, very timely, and as we get ready to introduce our
transitioning into a world free from the falsehood of communism. There are three key ways we do this: teach truth, keep memory, and seek justice. It's important to educate about the truth of communism, especially today, because of all the misinformation that exists nearly everywhere. The reality is, communism is deadly, dangerous, and number one. Billions still live oppressed by this false ideology. Whether it's high school teachers, college students, or members of Congress, we work to equip people with the facts about the deadliest ideology in history. We also strive to keep memory, which means preserving the stories of those who were killed by communist regimes. It's important to keep their memory alive so that we never forget just how horrible communism is. This is why we hold annuals to commemorate their lives and tell their stories through art, literature, music, and film. We seek justice for ethnic minorities and prisoners of conscience who are persecuted for their rights in China, Cuba, Laos, Vietnam, and Malaysia. This is passion about education, human rights, and justice. Join us in the fight against communism. Join us in the fight for freedom, prosperity, and peace.
Sense, along with panelists Rishan Abbas, Tolstrom Geiston, Francis Hugh, and Edward Lemon. Please come forward.
Well, thank you so much. I think that was a great introduction, the fireside chat. And now I think comes a very important part. Is this microphone on, by the way? No, it's not on, right? Should I be using this one, maybe? Okay, there we go. Apparently you have to press a button. I'm still learning. Well, we're now going to have a panel with the actual people who are right in the thick of it, who have experienced, who are experiencing transnational repression, who are studying it, who are dealing with it in the different diaspora communities related to the People's Republic of China. And in a minute, I will be introducing our distinguished panel. But I'm first starting out with just a couple of introductory remarks about the topic. I'd like to make some remarks also on current work that we are doing here at Victims of Communism on transnational repression. I'm doing this together with my colleague and research assistant, Morte Öklet, who is not here. She's based in Seattle. We're in the process of working on a research report on transnational repression. And based on that, I'm not going to talk about the substance of this report, but I'm going to offer some remarks that frame the topic conceptually, that help us to understand how can we get our heads around this fairly recent phenomenon and its impact. And then I'll be introducing the panelists, I'll ask them some questions, and we will again have Q&A from the audience. Now, the word TNR, or transnational repression, has been used multiple times now this evening. Very interestingly, the very notion of transnational repression provides an inherent limitation, a conceptual limitation. The prevailing focus on repression, which is overt coercion and force, overlooks or often overlooks a wider, more sophisticated toolkit of extraterritorial control that states now deploy, which goes beyond repression. To grasp this full spectrum, the research that is being produced by us at the moment proposes a more comprehensive framework based on the concept of transnational authoritarian control. And I'm not talking about this in order to promote my ideas, although maybe I am, who knows. But because I think there's an urgent need to actually broaden the debate, to widen the debate, and to show some of the same conceptual sophistication that we are being confronted with, that the victims are being confronted with. So the concept of transnational authoritarian control is based on the fundamental fact that transnational repression can essentially be understood as authoritarian regimes externalizing their domestic strategy, their domestic security strategies. Just as they maintain control at home through what scholars have identified as the 3 pillars of regime security, these same 3 pillars are now being projected abroad, I would argue. These are, first, transnational repression, TNR, the coercive stick that we're so familiar with, involving threats, violence, any coercive action. Secondly, this is complemented by transnational legitimation, or TNL. Legitimation strategies, the use of propaganda and narrative manipulation to enhance regime legitimacy and discredit critics. Of course, we're all familiar with that too. And third, transnational co-optation, or TNC, the strategic use of inducements or carrots to secure loyalty, collaboration, and political acquiescence. Now, the work that we're currently working on examines this 3-pillar framework through the PRC's campaign against Uyghur diaspora researchers documenting human rights abuses. We found that while direct TNR, transnational repression, such as digital harassment or coercion by proxy, remains a brutal reality, Beijing has also strategically evolved. It increasingly employs what we recognize as transnational co-optation. For example, the state first manufactures a vulnerability by severing all family contact and then offers the conditional restoration of that right, such as a visa to visit the homeland or a dying family member in the Uyghur homeland or in other parts in exchange for silence, compliance, or even collaboration. This combined strategy is, according to our research, devastatingly effective, and of course others have done a lot of the same work. It not only obstructs vital evidence collection and inflicts profound psychological distress, but it also fragments the diaspora community from within. Our key finding is that the PRC favors these tactics precisely because they're high in impact on the victim, yet low in what one can refer to, or what we refer to as transgressiveness in the eyes of host nations. Transgressiveness referring to the illegality or the illegitimacy of an act. Acts that are low in transgressiveness rarely violate criminal law, creating ambiguity and paralyzing the policy responses of democratic host states. And one of the big problems, I'm sure this will come up, is of course the very fact that host countries don't know how to deal with this issue. This is the reason why our efforts to address transnational authoritarianism need a broad understanding of the challenge, from overt to covert, from explicitly repressive to deviously insidious. Scholars, activists, victims, and practitioners need to capture and counter the spectrum of the 21st century authoritarian toolkit, encapsulated in acts of transnational authoritarian control, be they through transnational legitimation, co-optation, or repression. Now, I've said enough. Let us turn to our distinguished panelists, and thank you so much for coming here tonight. Let me very briefly introduce our distinguished panel. We have, firstly, Dr. Edward Lemon, who is president of the Oxford Society for Central Asian Affairs. His research focuses on the global dynamics of authoritarianism, particularly an expert on transnational repression, more so than myself. He is co-author of the book Backlash, China's Struggle for Influence in Central Asia, which is about to come out next week. So maybe we should do a book talk next. Okay. I'm going in the order in which you are sitting. Francis Quay is the Policy and Advocacy Coordinator at the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation and the founder and executive director of We the Hong Kongers. During the 2019 and 20 Hong Kong protests, Francis organized global solidarity efforts. Following the imposition of the national security law in 2020, she sought asylum in the US and became the first Hong Kong activist to be granted asylum here, apparently. In December 2023, the Hong Kong authorities, this was a highly publicized event, well publicized in the media, placed a $1 million Hong Kong dollar bounty on her under accusations of colluding with foreign forces pursuant to the national security law. So, talking about serious transnational repression. Next, we have Tsultrim Gyatso, Chinese liaison officer of the Office of Tibet in Washington, D.C. Tsultrim was born in Tibet and escaped to India when he was 13 years old. He has been active in promoting youth involvement in the Tibetan movement and engagement in Sino-Tibetan dialogue. He currently is serving as the China Director at the Office of Tibet here in Washington, working on youth outreach and government relations. And last but not least, we have Ruslan Abbas, Executive Director of Campaign for Uyghurs, a group she founded in 2017 to advocate and promote human rights and democratic freedoms for Uyghurs. She started her activism while she was a student at Xinjiang University in Xinjiang. Since her arrival in the United States, Abbas has been an ardent campaigner for the human rights of the Uyghur people, who have, of course, experienced extensive transnational repression. Now, we also had on the panel Dr. Bao Fu. Unfortunately, he cannot be with us today. He suffered from some injuries, I believe related to a dog attack, but nobody has interviewed the dog about his or her motivations. So we shall not classify this as an act of transnational repression at this point. Now, the focus of the panel is on the evolving nature and the growing sophistication and the increasing prevalence of TNR, or, as we may say, acts of transnational authoritarian control in general. I would like the panelists to respond, take about 3 to 4 or 5 minutes to respond so that we have time for Q&A later. And we will again take written questions from the audience. You may access cards at any time here. I think we still have people going around. Yes. Raise your hand if you would like a card. So I'm going to sit down now, so I don't look like a speaker or something. I was just doing this because the space seemed a little bit tight. Now, I would like to first ask you, Edward. You've conducted extensive research on transnational repression in Central Asia with a particular focus on Russia and China. Now, based on your work, how would you say have TNR practices evolved over time? How can they be categorized? And in which direction do you think we need to think to keep on top of the dictator's evolving toolkit to kind of understand the strategic calculus?
Well, thank you, Dr. Zans, for the invitation to speak at this esteemed panel. I'm not a victim of transnational repression. I'm a scholar who's worked on transnational repression for about the past decade. I think, as we discussed in the previous fireside chat, China is the worst of the worst when it comes to transnational repression, and it has some pretty competitive countries in this regard: Russia, Iran, Venezuela. But of all of these, China, by any measure, is the worst of the worst. If we look at Freedom House's data, and they build a global data set of transnational repression, China accounts for around a quarter of that data set. We built our own data set that just looked at the targeting of Uyghurs between 1997 and 2021, and we counted over 7,000 incidents of transnational repression, and that's just China's targeting of Uyghurs, not speaking of its targeting of dissidents, people from Hong Kong, people from Tibet, Mongolia, and Taiwan, and elsewhere. So China is the worst of the worst. China's the most global of all of these actors. Our data set found China targeted Uyghurs in 44 different countries. Freedom House's data set found over 50 countries. The research by Safeguard Defenders on the overseas police stations found over 100 countries. China is targeting individuals at all different corners of the globe. And China, I think, unlike many other actors, is often indiscriminate in its targeting. Many other actors, Russia and elsewhere, are targeting individuals for specific actions, for being dissidents. But in the case of China, it's targeting individuals for where they're from, for their ethnicity. And in an article we published in Globalizations, based on our research and data collection on the Uyghur issue, we said this is kind of an externalization of the genocide that's taking place within China itself. I think the one trend we've seen is a massive explosion of transnational oppression in the past few years. 97% of the cases we document in our data set happened since 2014. This is partly due to domestic developments in China, such as the launching of the Strike Hard campaign in Xinjiang in 2014, which was obviously an intensification of the ongoing genocide in that part of what is proclaimed to be China, the passing of the National Security Law in Hong Kong in 2020, the launching of Operation Fox Hunt, the international dimension of Xi Jinping's campaign against corruption. All of these and the general authoritarian crackdown we've seen in China has gone global, as Dr. Zenz said. But I think there's also things that are happening outside China that are making it a more conducive environment for China to use transnational repression. And one of these, of course, is the compliance of partners. I think most research on transnational repression has said that it often isn't unilateral. States need partners, be they private actors like technology companies or organized criminal groups or foreign governments to enable transnational repression to take place. And China has extradition treaties with 59 different countries, 45 of which have been ratified. It's using these linkages to enact transnational repression. It's using the leverage it has over many of these countries through the high levels of debt they have to China and high levels of investment to enact transnational repression on a range of different targets. It's working through Interpol to use the Red Nova system, a system that was set up to allow countries to pursue criminals abroad. It's using those to target individuals who are speaking out against the communist regime. It's creating its own authoritarian international organizations, such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that has its own internal mechanisms to allow individuals to be quickly transferred between different countries. So China's reach is growing. I think it's becoming increasingly sophisticated, as Dr. Zen said, in its use of different tactics and practices. Its targets are very broad. They range from individuals who oppose the regime through to individuals who merely are viewed as threats because of their ethnic background or religious group. We're talking about the Falun Gong or other Christian groups within China. And ultimately, it's also developing a very sophisticated set of actors, ranging from the United Front Work Department, to all the way through to technology companies. And it's increasingly using technologies, including AI, to use deepfakes against dissidents, where they have videos purporting and photos purporting to be them that are doctored and manipulated and make them, humiliate them. Make them say things that they didn't say. There are various apps that are being, and malware that is being sent to dissidents, and then other individuals that are being installed on their phone and then install spyware. So China increasingly is developing a very sophisticated transnational repression campaign that is very difficult for we who are opposed to the Chinese Communist Party, who are opposed to global authoritarianism, to resist. I think the other thing it's capitalizing on is the growing reticence towards granting asylum to individuals in different countries in Europe and the United States. It's often capitalizing on that to have individuals denied asylum and sent back to China. So I think it's an increasingly fertile field for which China can act. Happy to discuss potential solutions to this in the Q&A. But I'll end it there.
Well, much more could be said out of the wealth of your research and your data, and we are extensively citing your work in our article and the data set of transnational repression These are all very nascent efforts to understand and research a very recent, but as you say, rapidly growing phenomenon with a rapidly growing footprint impacting the victim communities. Thank you so much for sharing those insights. Now, I think we are well prepared at this point to turn towards the victim communities who are affected very specifically by this. I'm going to stick to the order where I send out the questions to you guys. So you, I would like to first turn to Rushan here. Rushan, the Uyghurs have been a particular focus of transnational repression, obviously, and the intensity is very clear. Now, as our research shows, they also are growing targets of co-optation through inducements. So it's not just the stick, it's also the carrot. You have something to gain by remaining silent, by remaining inactive. And this has been very effective in dividing the Uyghur diaspora. The possibility of traveling back to the Uyghur homeland to visit family in exchange for silence and inaction over this ongoing genocide. Now, what is in your view, have the CCP's co-optation efforts been effective? And what is the way forward for the Uyghur diaspora in confronting this sort of sophisticated challenge?
Thank you so much, Andy. This is a very important topic for all of us. And as I always say, this is not just about the transnational repression against the Uyghurs and the Uyghurs or Tibetans or Hong Kongers issue. It is also a national security issue, and as well as it is an issue for all of us, because we are, at first and foremost, we are Americans. Uyghur American, Tibetan American, and Hong Kong American. But our safety in this country is being shadowed by this dictatorship government. What you just said, Adrian, is being one of the most painful dilemmas that our society, our community is facing currently. Every Uyghur is forced into the impossible choices because the Chinese government is weaponizing our love for our families, our parents, our homeland. They know that the deepest vulnerability of the Uyghur diaspora community is our families. Yet, the Chinese government is using this against us and the silencing the Uyghur community. I'm just sitting here earlier when Honorable Gallagher was speaking, looking around. In this room, other than me, there's only 3 other Uyghurs. My brother, my husband, and our dear friend Alan Seto. A few years ago, when we had events like this, or any hearings at the Hill, we used to have at least a couple dozen Uyghurs coming and showing support and listening, because this is directly related to our people who are back home. But where are these people now? And exactly because of this topic Adrian just mentioned. So they are having either, the Chinese government is having either the police or the family members or parents calling the people here in America and asking them to stay silent. So either they get passport to come and visit their children here, or they can get some sort of access to families, making phone calls. All of us, all the Uyghurs in diaspora, actually it has been 7-8 years since we last communicated with our loved ones. I can just speak for my husband sitting here and Alan Seto and my brother. None of us has been communicated with anybody. My husband learned his father's death 8 months later, after having absolutely no communication with them since summer of 2017. And he learned that his father died in August 23, and all he knew is his father died in January. In information era, today's world, that he doesn't know exactly which day in January he lost his father, and where, in the camp or in jail. We have no idea. My sister is one of the best examples of Uyghur Americans speaking out against this mass atrocity. And a retired medical doctor. She's in jail since September 2018. Only 5 days after I participated in a panel like this at Hudson Institute. And yet we speak out because the silence is the oxygen of tyranny. And that's what they're counting on by transnational repression, by offering these kind of trips to back home, or having family members come and visit, or having some sort of phone conversation with families, or offering renewal of passports, or threatening to arrest their family members. So with all this, it's being impactful. It is actually effectively silencing the Uyghur communities. Not only that, actually, yes, we are talking about the Uyghur community here, and your question is directed to how this is impacting the Uyghur community, but how about the academia, self-censorship in the mainstream media? When Xinjiang police files, through amazing work from victims of communism and the Dr. Regime Sensei, when that was being released, that didn't make it to the mainstream media every night as a breaking news. When we had thousands of pictures of actual people in 21st century's modern genocide. When 13 tons of human hair, how many lives does it represent? When that made it over to the US Customs and Border Patrol, we didn't see that being covered in mainstream media. So when it comes to the Uyghurs' rights to speak, and that's being silenced, or the transnational repression that every single Uyghur person around in diaspora are subject to, it's also being the national security issue for the United States, because the Chinese government is using those trips or phone calls or those kind of manipulations by asking some of the Uyghur community members to spy against the Uyghur community or any information they can get. To answer the question, has this co-optation worked? In some cases, yes. For a time, some people have grown quiet out of fear, and that silence is exactly what Beijing is asking for, and also creating a problem or internal diversity among the Uyghur community. People are attacking each other, and calling it, visiting is wrong, or having family members come and visit is, these are not acceptable. Yes, in some cases, it feels like that we are supporting China's whitewashing the genocide, but at the same time, how do you judge that? How do you judge people's love for their ailing parents, their aging parents, if they want to communicate with them while they're still alive, after 7-8 years of absolutely cut of any kind of communications? How do we judge that? Of course, we need to continue what we are doing, because best way of standing up for bullying like this, the unfair and the coercive, actually criminal act, we should call this illegal and criminal act, is continuously speaking out, speaking the truth. I think I'm over time.
Thank you so much, Rushan. Silence is the oxygen of tyranny. Very powerful. Very powerful. Sultran, thank you for being here. The Tibetan exile community has faced the CCP's repression for decades. It's been a political issue for a long time. In your opinion, how has Beijing modernized its playbook in a digital era compared with earlier years of surveillance and infiltration of Tibetan communities. Kind of to say, what advice do you have from decades of experience with forms of transnational repression for the other diaspora groups? Also for maintaining the resilience, unity, and effectiveness of a diaspora community in the face of the TNR. The Tibetans have held together for many decades. Thank you.
Thank you. Sure, so on?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Zen, for having us and moderate this panel. It's an honor to join this panel with Russian Francis and Edward. Like Dr. Zen mentioned, Tibetan people are victims of Chinese communism, and we have been in this resistance for more than 70 years. And it started by the invasion, the so-called People's Liberation Army, but we're still struggling right now, and the resistance carried on by the generations of Tibetans. In that sense, I kind of admire one of the conclusions that Dr. Masu concluded in one of his podcast episodes that was there on Tibet. And he was saying that China actually miserably failed to win the hearts and minds of Tibetan people, no matter how much money they put in on Tibet, or how many effort they put on to buy people out from Tibet, but they were never been a successful situation out there. I believe that technology development actually brought the world together and our communication made easier than ever, but in terms of Beijing's modernization has severely harmed creating a free society in China. With the amount of surveillance cameras in China, China has become the world's largest digital surveillance apparatus. There are so many people who are working on this, and artificial intelligence is used on all this surveillance tactics. And I believe that it has transformed to not only China, but particularly inside Tibet, that they were able to put the whole Tibetan community, everyone inside Tibet, into a huge digital cage that they can detect anything that you do or any move that you are trying to do for resilience for the Tibetan cause. So some of the sources that I was searching on, it says that China has probably have more than 700 million surveillance camera out there, which is almost one camera on two people, what they say. But in Tibet, I believe there are multiple cameras or lenses that is focusing on the mobility of Tibetan people who are trying to put their actions on the Tibetan coast. So early years, I think the surveillance and infiltrations by the Chinese authority on Tibetan people are done through the implements. They use human resources to do it, but because of the artificial intelligence, the technology developments, now they are able to detect everything through simply using some of the high tech that they're using. So in terms of Tibet, they are able to categorize everybody in the land who are working or who are doing any kind of actions, and categorize them and put them in a virtually categorizable way to detect every action. So, and I think that these are some of the things that really hard for us Tibetans to counter, because sadly some of the high tech are actually came from the United States, and there's a report that came from Associated Press a month ago and talking about all the Silicon Valley companies that actually came up with all this really high tech that can detect all the actions by the people, and which was sold to China, and China is using these technologies now to oppress the people in Tibet. So similar things are definitely happening inside Uyghur community and to the other freedom fighters inside that was oppressed by China. So in that case, we are dealing with a really aggressive, really extraordinarily strong adversary. But I think the reason that Tibetans are not felt in terms of maintaining the resilience for so many years is because of the leadership of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and also because that we didn't lose our hope, hope for the change, hope that we believe that His Holiness can return to Tibet, and that kind of hope have never died from the Tibetan people. And another reason that I think that was able to help us to maintain our resilience was because of the democratic system that was built in exile, and the people who are diaspora are able to treasure these democratic institutions. And I wouldn't say advice to the other communities, but one of the suggestions is that not to lose hope and maintain or create or build a democratic institute that can sustain our work or sustain the movement forward. I think that would be my answer to that question.
Thank you. Thank you. A very important point. I feel this is a very important point is being made about diaspora resilience here. Really about the democratic structures, and of course, the figurehead of the Dalai Lama helped bring Tibetans together, and of course many Tibetans fled and were able to establish sort of a presence outside. So that is a big challenge. Now, let us turn to Francis. As a Hong Konger, the CCP has placed a big bounty on your head. And this is a powerful example of TNR because it's high in repressiveness, but it's also low in transgressiveness because it's, in some ways, it's not directly illegal in relation to the country you live on, like in the United States. After all, Hong Kong is relying on domestic laws. And this attack, in many ways, is paradigmatic of this strategy, this devious strategy of the CCP, to be low in transgressiveness but high in impact. Can this attack on you be understood as a textbook example for authoritarian innovation? How do democratic host nations need to adapt to these evolving challenges?
Yeah, so I wanted to first thank you, VOC, for inviting me to speak. And I wanted to quickly point out, before getting to the question, quickly point out that I'm actually not the originally invited Hong Kong representative to speak. And the reason why I want to point this out is many of you know that Anna Paul was originally invited. And I wanted to point this out because we're talking about transnational repression right now, and the very reason that she can't come here today is because of transnational repression. And this has to do with her father's case, who was arrested and prosecuted under the national security law for handling her daughter's financial assets in Hong Kong. So, my parents have been questioned in Hong Kong. Many of our family members and friends associated with us have also experienced the same, but not to the scale that Anna's father have faced, who, obviously is the first and only family member of an exile activist who is prosecuted under the national security law. So I wanted to acknowledge that and just to, again, highlight this as a very fresh example in front of you of transnational repression, and to ask everyone to remember her and to keep her and her father's in your prayer. So to answer a question, I think the first thing I would say is that I think democratic countries need to look past the traditional methods of transnational repression. You mentioned about authoritarian innovation, and Dr. Lemon talked about different other developments of other methods of transnational repression. For example, the digital lies of these harassment and threats.
people are being targeted using AI. Their video, DeepSeek video created of them saying things that they didn't say. These are technologies that I think authoritarian regimes are relying on right now. And we oftentimes think about, when we talk about transnational repression, I think the public, and usually we think about the traditional method like assassination, kidnapping, extradition. But this is not CCP's playbook, because they know that these methods would create a very big diplomatic pushback and public attention. If you compare someone, a journalist being assassinated and an activist facing daily harassment online, I think they are actually, they're kind of on the same scale. The activists are facing daily harassment and threats every day. But who will get the most attention and who would get the most pushback, obviously, is the assassination cases. And so I think we need to figure out a way, I guess, for democratic countries and the public, we need to understand that this have developed in different other ways. Like we mentioned, China's transnational repression is actually very sophisticated and comprehensive, and this is why they have been very careful. The second of all, I wanted to step back a little bit to think about the goal of putting bounty on some of us. I think obviously, ultimately, they wanted to get us and put us in jail for life sentencing. But I don't think that's really what they think they can do. Obviously, it's very difficult. It would be a bonus if they are able to somehow get us. But I think the basic, which is like the most easiest thing that they can do with putting the bounty on us, is to establish the legality for them to go forward with the less lethal acts of transnational repression, which is the harassment, the threats, harassing our family members in Hong Kong, cutting our financial assets, cutting our financial sources, and things like that, to create trouble for us so that eventually we will give up, because many of us obviously are also facing other challenges in our life as an immigrant, trying to settle up in a different country. So they wanted to create more trouble for us, and at the same time create fear within the community. Rashan Abbas just mentioned, the chilling effects across the community. So people see that, they would get into trouble. They would face this kind of harassment if they speak up. So they would take the most convenient way out of it is to not speak up. And so I think that's really more like of the goal of CCP is trying to do. And so it's not really, they're not taking the difficult way to like violate US law and kidnap us and things like that. I think at the same time, we also need to understand that US law has flaws. It's really difficult to hold these perpetrators accountable. I would just make another example of why I say, our law has flaws, and I think they are taking advantage of our rule of law system, is that earlier this year I testified in the federal court as a witness in a case involving a Chinese American who was indicted by the US for acting as a foreign agent illegally for China without registering. And I testified because I was one of the victims that he spied on. He allegedly had been to multiple events and protests that I organized, and took pictures and videos and sent them back to Chinese officials. There are so many evidence listed out, presented in the court, which you would think that, obviously he is acting as a foreign agent for China, but he acquitted despite all these evidence. And I think the reason behind it is that it's really difficult to prosecute someone and have a success case under this charge. There is a very high threshold to get him convicted. Second of all, the jury has a very difficult task. They find it very challenging to understand the complexity of the case, right? That's what I think. And that has to do with the public awareness, the public understanding about transnational repression. The defense have been saying that this is a case of First Amendment, which it is not. The judge has said that it's not, but it confused the jury and misled the jury. And so that's why I think it was, we failed to hold this person accountable. And this was like actually one of a few cases that we are able to actually bring up to the justice system and have a court trial. But yeah, it's just so difficult to get through. So I would just end with two recommendations. I think, I said it earlier, I think authoritarian regimes need to understand, need to look past the traditional way of transnational repression. But also, we need to enhance public awareness and provide trainings for law enforcement for them to understand what transnational repression is all about. And the third thing would be to develop the legal tools to fill up the loopholes we have in our U.S. justice system to effectively hold perpetrators accountable. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you very much, Francis. Very powerful, and thank you for making the comments about Anna Kwok, who indeed was supposed to be here. So we got a number of very interesting questions from the audience. And for the sake of trying to address many of them, I'd like to ask the panelists to limit their responses to like 1 minute, as in roughly 60 seconds, maybe, plus minus. And one of the questions is exactly one I was actually considering to ask, and would be very interested to hear about. And maybe we can, and I would like Rushan, Sutram, and Francis to respond to them. Edward, you have a special question, has your name written over it, so it'll be your turn soon. So maybe starting with Rushan, the question is basically what Francis already addressed. What measures do Western countries need to take? What would you recommend? Where are the gaps? What should they do? And another question relates to, well, is there also something that maybe Western companies need to do differently? And of course, this could relate to, should Western governments enact something that forces Western companies to do something different to counter transnational repression?
Yes, that's we have been trying to push, and there was a law actually being introduced, bill being introduced in 2023 to address transnational repression. We really need to push the bills being passed and make it law that every citizen in this country are entitled to have a safe environment when they exercise their First Amendment rights. So that's one critical thing that we could do. For the companies, same thing. As it was mentioned earlier by Representative Gallagher, the U.S. social media companies are not allowed in China. Why do we have the Chinese officials or bots or trolls come and attack us when there's a harassment and the intimidation and the threats? We call that the freedom of speech, and they are allowed to continuously do that. But when we receive death threats, videos are being released calling for our execution. Those shouldn't be counted as just a part of the freedom of speech. The accountability on the legal system is important.
Thank you. Very good point. Sutram.
I think Western countries definitely have more space to do more, and especially the companies who are financially tied with global financial trade with China. There have been so many cases in terms of Tibet, and I think it applies to Uyghurs and Hong Uyghurs, that China is able to influence lawmakers in the United States, in other Western countries, and also institutions, including universities and individuals also. So in order to fight TNR, like earlier we were mentioning about the sophisticated law requirements that actually making it harder for us to counter how to stop TNR in the land of freedom. But I think we have to step up in our game and first let them know what kind of TNR is actually happening inside the country. I believe the United States is probably one of the less kind of people who are getting TNR from China, but then the other countries definitely were much how should I put it, infiltrated or was influenced by Chinese for sure. So I think we have to step up.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think the U.S. government or any democratic countries, they should work with tech companies to detect state-linked disinformation campaign and harassment, so the law enforcement would be more easily to be able to track these activities and really tackle the digital side of transnational repression. I also think that major companies have a really important task here because small businesses usually have a more difficult time to step up because they just lack the backbone and foundation to take the risk. And so, that's what I think would be my suggestion. And I also wanted to point out about the Hong Kong Economic and Trade offices that are located around the world, including 3 locations in the U.S., in Washington, D.C., in New York, and San Francisco. They are overseas offices for the Hong Kong government. They're directly under the Hong Kong government, yet they enjoy diplomatic status. They enjoy diplomatic privileges in the U.S., just like other consulates and embassies in the U.S. And they're also acting as I would say they're also spying on us, influencing U.S. policies locally here to lobby against some of the pro-democracy legislations and lobby for the Chinese government. We have been raising awareness about these HKETO offices. They are not just in the U.S., they're in the UK, in Canada, and European countries, and Asian countries. And even in the UK office, there are officers being prosecuted for espionage, specifically in the UK, and that's something to look into. That's probably what they're doing in the US, and we need to really reconsider their status and revoke their status and shut them down in the US. As an outpost, I think they're an outpost of the Hong Kong government, just like the secret police station for the Chinese government.
Thank you. Thank you for all these contributions. A lot of work is ahead, a lot of regulation, a lot of understanding. And speaking of understanding, we have a slightly more sort of an understanding question about the nature of TNR, directed specifically towards Dr. Lemon. Could you speak a bit more about the economic components of TNR? Is it individually focused or state-focused in some regions? And I guess the concept of state, like TNR, not just focused on individual, but on an entire region or state. What would you say to that?
Well, I think to answer the first part of the question, economics and financial issues interplay with transnational repression in a number of ways. I think firstly as a driver, China has used transnational repression to pursue individual support as part of its anti-corruption campaign. Other countries like the United Arab Emirates, for example, uses Interpol really as a debt collector. Right? If you accumulate credit card debt in the UAE as a resident and then leave the country, they'll try and pursue you through Interpol to try and have you arrested and then use that as leverage to bring that money back. So I think it can drive transnational repression, and they'll also use transnational repression to make individuals' lives very difficult. Open a bank accounts, have assets seized, have the assets of your family confiscated in your home country as part of proxy repression. As Adrian talked about, pressure on the family at home to try and make individuals change their behavior. So it's interrelated in multiple ways. And of course, economic leverage can also, that China has, as I said in my remarks, also leads it to be able to put pressure on governments to return individuals or to allow Chinese agents to operate within their territory. In terms of whether transnational repression is very targeted or more general and more statewide, I think the Uyghur case is distinct, and the Tibetan case as well, and insofar as these individuals are often targeted not just because they have done anything, but because they're from that country. It's really an externalization of those internal genocidal policies. And in general, I think, as the other panelists have mentioned, part of the goal is of targeting one individual is often to create this climate of fear, so that everyone, even if they're not directly being targeted, they assume they're being surveilled, they assume they're being monitored, they assume that they are unsafe to take certain actions. So I think even if it's targeted, it's often about creating a climate of fear.
And maybe that is part of the problem also of states addressing TNR, because TNR on the one hand is individual, and then you try to prosecute individuals, right? Or you try to come to grips with repression or cooptation access to individuals. But then the problem is that it's systemic. And the systemic nature shows it's hard to grasp. It's hard to find enough evidence on the one person who followed you, right? Who's part of a systemic strategy. So yeah, thank you very much for these remarks, for helping us grapple with the complexities of the challenge that we are addressing here. Now, a very interesting question by somebody from the audience who says, beyond image doctoring, is generative AI being used to automate and scale transnational repression and expand it to anyone, regardless of origin, who speaks out against the CCP, or more broadly, how does the emergence of AI change the efforts also to combat TNR? Okay, so the kind of a two-faced question. On the one hand, AI helps states like Beijing as a multiplier of transnational repression, but it could also be used to combat transnational repression. Any of the panelists is welcome to respond to this. Rusha.
Actually, we are being subject to every aspect of the digital and the AI generated attacks against our reputation and the character assassination by the CCP. They are using the technology to achieve their goals, to do the TNR in the next level. So I think, again, it comes back to the companies, holding those companies accountable. So the Beijing is not going to do that, but you name it, like deepfake and the images, AI-generated pictures, all kind of, like my X account, I have to disable the comment section every time I post something, because if I don't, then within like an hour, I've got like tons of really, X-rated pictures and the comments and just different names and different things. Even I've got so many fake accounts on the X that are confusing people, and they create the story, my picture, and they even posting some of, reposting some of my own posters, just confuse people. So the Beijing is using every aspect of technology in the best way they can.
It is definitely, Beijing is definitely using AI to detect every single action that all the interested people that they want to find it out. It's already been an algorithm-driven world, and all the algorithms that Chinese authorities setting up for not only the authority but all the tech giants in China who are actually running out the whole system are needed to report everything to the Chinese authorities. So in that sense, for instance, we are using WeChat in United States. We are using Red Note. All those apps, they can detect what you are saying, what you are doing, and at a certain level, even you are trying to reach out to the family members who are inside Tibet, they can detect who are you are connected with. So in that kind of sense, they're definitely using it, and they are also trying to use these platforms to kind of sometimes to threaten you that not to post any actions by using those family members who are inside the home country.
I wanted to bring out an example recently of a video, AI video created on Hong Kong activists. The AI videos recently have circulated around the UK Hong Kong community, which impersonates the Hong Kong activists in the UK, having kind of like a Zoom call between three of them. And they were basically making comments about, the Hong Kong community in the UK. They're so stupid. They don't understand the policy there. And none of them have said that in real life. But that video was created, and you can see the motive behind that is that the CCP is trying to divide the community, to portray their character as, they're betraying their community, they are talking bad things behind them, privately in closed door, which never happened. But that, shows their intention, which is to, character assassination and all that. I think I'm not a very creative or imaginary person, but I would say the thing that I can come up with right now is I think the U.S. and different free countries, they should try to use AI to detect the AI video and work with tech company so that, for example, if it's on social media, there will be like a community notes or something like that to kind of label any AI video as an AI video, so that the readers and users of social media, they know what they're consuming. I know it's difficult to detect every AI video as technology is advancing very exponentially right now, but that would at least help a lot of help a little bit of to counter the disinformation campaign that the CCP is putting out.
Trying to add one more thing. I believe that China is definitely strategizing AI for their next kind of plan for the next century or next 5-year plan or whatever plans they are trying to do. One clear example that I heard about it was even people who are coming up with AIs in the other side of the world, Tibetans are able to come up with the AI called it's supposed to be a large language model that trying to preserve the Tibetan language. We were so grateful that there's people who are able to come up with this kind of AI within the Tibetan community. But China, what they think is they can buy it out. They are offering some of financial gains for this person to come to their side, and this types of actions is happening. But fortunately, those people who are watching over the Tibetan AI is not so able to fool them. So things like that is definitely happening.
Thank you so much. AI is a huge challenge because it's a force multiplier, and so it will naturally empower the more powerful. Just like people say AI will empower those in the workforce who are already more ahead, more intelligent, more powerful, more resourceful. It will exacerbate the difference between the weak and the strong. And it looks like in transnational authoritarianism that is the case. Now, in closing, I would like to summarize. I think we've learned today. We've learned from the panelists. We've learned that research and activism can and should focus more on the role and complicity of companies in more ways than one, and that the role of companies should also be one of the things that our governments need to look at very closely. And I think that's a very important takeaway to have on this very big topic. Well, please join me in thanking our panelists so much. Thank you, and we will have a book talk with a book involving Rushan Abbas's most recent book, Unbroken in the Face of Transnational Repression, and later on there will be a reception. Sorry, did
Oh, you didn't steal my thunder.
Did I steal your? No. Okay.
So I think right now, if you wanted to take a bathroom break, since we didn't really get a chance to do any of that earlier, please feel free to do so, and then we will meet outside of here in the lecture hall to hear from Rashan Abbas and her wonderful book that I had the pleasure of reading, and her powerful story about her sister. So the bathrooms are right out front, and we'll see you in the lecture hall. Thank you.
It's so cold here.
It is. Yeah. The AC blows on
I know, isn't it?
It's the design flaw.
It's keeping us awake.
Wait, they blow from the...
Yes, from the floor. The air conditioning.